June 8, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The cattle truck rattles to a stop on a dirt road that stretches flat and endless in every direction. Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann climbs down into the late afternoon heat, his legs unsteady after 3 days of travel from the East Coast Processing Center. The sun hangs low and enormous over fields of wheat that roll toward the horizon like an ocean frozen mid-swell. The air smells of dust and something else, something baking. Hoffmann has not eaten bread in 4 months. Not real bread. Not the kind that his mother used to pull from the oven in their kitchen in Saxony, crusty and steaming, smelling of yeast and promise. In the Africa Corps, they had eaten hardtack that could break teeth. On the transport ship from North Africa to America, they had eaten thin gruel and boiled potatoes. He had learned not to think about food, learned to treat hunger as a permanent condition like thirst or exhaustion. But now, stepping through the gates of Camp Concordia, past the guard towers and double fence lines, past the American soldiers who watch with expressions neither hostile nor sympathetic, he smells bread baking. Fresh bread. The scent is so overwhelming, so impossibly rich after months of deprivation, that for a moment he forgets where he is. For a moment, he is 10 years old again, standing in his mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning, watching her flour-dusted hands shape the dough. Then reality reasserts itself. He is a prisoner of war. This is enemy territory. And nothing about this makes sense. The United States Army had been capturing German soldiers in significant numbers since November 1942, when Operation Torch landed Allied forces in North Africa and began the systematic dismantling of Rommel's Afrika Korps. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, more than 140,000 German prisoners were being held in camps across the American mainland, a number that would swell to over 370,000 by war's end. These men arrived expecting the treatment that German propaganda had prepared them for: brutality, starvation, perhaps execution. The Nazi regime had spent years constructing an image of Americans as mongrelized, decadent, and given to barbarism when their material comforts were threatened. German soldiers were told that surrender meant death or slavery, that the Americans would work them to exhaustion in mines or factories, that they would be beaten, starved, and humiliated. This was not mere propaganda. It was strategic doctrine designed to ensure that German soldiers fought to the death rather than face capture. And for many, especially on the Eastern Front where Soviet treatment of prisoners made the propaganda seem mild by comparison, the fear was rational and well-founded. But the Americans were not the Soviets. And the treatment of prisoners in American camps was governed not by vengeance but by a complex mixture of legal obligation, strategic calculation, and, though few on either side would have articulated it this way, ideological demonstration. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established detailed standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. Unlike Germany, which systematically violated the convention in its treatment of Soviet prisoners, or Japan, which had never signed it at all, the United States chose to follow the convention meticulously, even when dealing with prisoners from nations that did not reciprocate. This decision was partly pragmatic. American prisoners in German hands were more likely to receive humane treatment if the United States set an example, but it was also philosophical. The American military leadership understood, perhaps more clearly than their enemies, that the war was not merely a contest of arms but a conflict of systems, and that the treatment of prisoners was a demonstration of which system was superior. Hoffmann had surrendered near Tunis in May 1943, along with what remained of his artillery battalion. They had been out of ammunition for 3 days, out of food for 2, and down to a single working vehicle. The British forces that accepted their surrender had been efficient and impersonal, herding them into makeshift camps where they sat in the sun for a week before being loaded onto ships for transport to America. During that week, Hoffmann had watched men die from untreated wounds, from dysentery, from simple despair. He had watched soldiers trade wedding rings for cigarettes, photographs of children for water. He had become accustomed to the idea that this was how the rest of his life would be: deprivation, degradation, survival reduced to its most basic arithmetic. The ship to America had been crowded and uncomfortable, but not intentionally cruel. They were fed twice daily, not well, but adequately. The American guards maintained order without excessive brutality. It was all very mechanical, very organized, very American in its impersonal efficiency. Nothing had prepared him for abundance. The barracks at Camp Concordia were wooden structures raised on concrete foundations, winterized despite the Kansas heat, each one housing 40 men in bunks with mattresses and blankets. There were showers, actual showers with hot water, available twice weekly. There was a latrine system that functioned. There was electric lighting. The mess hall, where Hoffman lined up that first evening with hundreds of other prisoners, was larger than any building he had seen in months. And the food. Dear God, the food. Each man received a metal tray divided into sections. The servers, American soldiers, not prisoners, filled each section with mechanical efficiency. Boiled potatoes. Green beans. A portion of meat that Hoffman could not immediately identify. Pork, he would learn, cooked in a style unfamiliar to him. A square of butter, an impossible luxury, glistening yellow. And bread. 2 slices of white bread, soft and fresh, still faintly warm. Hoffman carried his tray to a table and sat. Around him, men were eating in silence, the kind of intense, focused silence that comes when hunger meets unexpected satisfaction. He picked up the bread. It compressed slightly under his fingers. Real bread, not hardtack, not the sawdust and ersatz concoctions that had become standard in Germany. He bit into it. The texture was softer than German bread, less dense, almost cake-like. But it was real. It was abundant. And in that moment, sitting in an enemy prison camp 5,000 miles from home, Hoffman began to understand that everything he had been told about America was wrong. The cognitive dissonance was shared by thousands of German prisoners across hundreds of camps. They had been prepared for hardship. They encountered routine. They had been prepared for starvation. They encountered rations that, while not luxurious, exceeded what German civilians were receiving back home. They had been prepared for abuse. They encountered boredom. The American camp system operated according to regulations that seemed, to men raised under totalitarian discipline, almost incomprehensibly legalistic. Prisoners could not be forced to work in war industries. Geneva Convention, Article 27. They could not be subjected to punitive labor beyond what was necessary for camp maintenance. Article 32. They were entitled to the same rations as American soldiers of equivalent rank. Article 11. They were permitted to send and receive mail, subject to censorship. Article 36. They were allowed to organize their own internal governance, elect spokesmen, file complaints through proper channels. The system was bureaucratic, regulated, fundamentally opposed to arbitrary cruelty. This was not mercy in the sentimental sense. It was policy. But to men who had lived under a system where policy was whatever the nearest SS officer decided it should be, the distinction was profound. The cigarettes became the second revelation, almost more shocking than the bread. American soldiers smoked constantly. Hoffman had noticed this on the transport ship, had noticed it at the processing center, noticed it now as the guards walked the perimeter of the compound. They smoked with a casual abundance that suggested cigarettes were infinite, renewable, hardly worth thinking about. In the Wehrmacht, cigarettes had been precious currency. A single cigarette could buy information, services, favors. Men hoarded them, rationed them, smoked them down to tiny butts that burned their fingers. The German ration had been 6 cigarettes per day when available, which was rarely, and by 1943 even that ration was often filled with substitutes, dried leaves, sawdust, anything that would burn. But here, on the 3rd day in Camp Concordia, the prisoners were informed that they would receive an allowance from the camp canteen. Each man was entitled to purchase, with scrip earned from labor, up to 1 pack of cigarettes per day. 1 pack. 20 cigarettes. The price was nominal, subsidized. And for those who could not afford even the subsidized price, there were free rations, not as generous, but available. American cigarettes. Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. Hoffman held the pack in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the crisp cellophane wrapping. 20 cigarettes. He opened the pack carefully, extracted one, lit it with a match from the book stapled to the pack, free matches, casually abundant, and inhaled. The tobacco was milder than German cigarettes, less harsh, but that was not what stunned him. What stunned him was the implication. The Americans could afford to give enemy prisoners cigarettes by the pack. Daily. What kind of industrial capacity made that possible? The answer was visible everywhere once you learned to see it. The uniforms the American guards wore were mass-produced but well-made, replaced regularly, discarded when worn. The vehicles that moved around the camp were new or nearly new. Trucks, jeeps, sedans, all standardized, all maintained. The food in the mess hall varied but never disappeared. There were occasional shortages of specific items. Fresh fruit was rare, Coffee sometimes ran out, but the overall abundance never wavered. The camp itself, which housed over 4,000 prisoners at peak capacity, was supplied by a logistics network that delivered food, clothing, medical supplies, fuel, and mail with mechanical regularity. Trains arrived weekly. Trucks made daily runs. The system never stopped. Hoffman began to realize that the camp was not an exception but a microcosm, a tiny representation of an economic system that operated on principles fundamentally different from anything he had known. In Germany, scarcity was assumed. Resources were finite, carefully allocated, hoarded against future need. In America, or at least in this corner of America visible through the prison fence, abundance was assumed. Resources flowed continuously, waste was tolerated as inevitable, the system produced surplus as a matter of course. This realization was deeply, existentially unsettling. Hoffman had been raised in a Germany that defined itself through sacrifice and struggle. The Nazi ideology glorified hardship, celebrated austerity, promised that suffering would forge a stronger race. The entire moral framework rested on the premise that Germans were tougher, more disciplined, more willing to endure than their decadent enemies. But here was evidence that the premise was false. The Americans were not suffering. They were not struggling. And yet they were winning. The disconnect was profound enough that many prisoners initially rejected the evidence before them. The abundance, they told themselves, was temporary, a facade maintained to deceive Red Cross inspectors. The cigarettes were propaganda. The bread was a trick to lower their guard. Surely the real America, the America beyond the camp fences, was suffering just as Germany was suffering. Surely the civilians were rationing, sacrificing, enduring hardship. They were not. Prisoners who worked on labor details outside the camp, agricultural work, mostly, permitted under the Geneva Convention, returned with reports that seemed like fantasies. They had seen American farmhouses with electricity and indoor plumbing. They had seen automobiles parked in driveways, not one per village as in Germany but multiple per household. They had seen grocery stores stocked with goods in varieties and quantities that German stores had not seen since before the war. One prisoner, working on a wheat harvest in western Kansas, reported that the farmer had complained about wartime shortages that, when described, sounded like abundance to German ears. The farmer was upset that he could only buy 3 pounds of coffee per week instead of 5. He was frustrated that new automobile tires were unavailable, forcing him to carefully maintain his existing tires instead of replacing them casually. These were his hardships. 3 pounds of coffee per week. The prisoner who heard this returned to camp shaken, unable to reconcile the reality with everything he had been taught about American weakness and degeneracy. The mail from home provided the final, crushing confirmation. Letters from Germany, heavily censored but still informative, described conditions that were deteriorating rapidly. By late 1944, German cities were being bombed around the clock. Food rations had been cut repeatedly. Clothing was scarce. Fuel was almost non-existent for civilian use. The letters were carefully worded to avoid censorship, but the desperation leaked through in what was not said, in the forced cheerfulness that could not quite mask the reality. Hoffman's mother wrote that she was well, that she had enough of everything important, that he should not worry. But she mentioned in passing that she had traded her winter coat for potatoes, that she was growing vegetables in the apartment window boxes, that his younger brother had been conscripted at age 16 into a Volkssturm unit equipped with rifles from the previous century. The contrast was inescapable. Hoffman was eating fresh bread and smoking American cigarettes in a Kansas prison camp while his family was starving in a collapsing Reich. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound and took different forms depending on the individual prisoner. Some men retreated into denial, insisting that the letters were forgeries, that German propaganda about imminent victory must be true, that the hardships at home were temporary setbacks. These men formed the core of the Nazi hardliners who organized themselves in many camps into shadow hierarchies, enforcing ideological conformity, punishing those who expressed doubt or collaborated too openly with the Americans. They ran camp courts that meted out beatings and intimidation to prisoners who seemed too comfortable, too willing to accept American treatment at face value. The camp authorities generally tolerated these internal hierarchies as long as they did not disrupt overall order, a policy that would later be recognized as a mistake, as it allowed Nazi ideology to persist and even flourish behind the wire. But other prisoners underwent genuine transformations, slow erosions of certainty that manifested first in small doubts and eventually in fundamental reconsiderations. Hoffman found himself in this latter category, though he did not recognize it at first. The doubts began with simple observations. If the Americans were decadent and weak, how had they built this camp system that housed hundreds of thousands of prisoners with such efficiency? If the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy controlled America as propaganda claimed, why were the Jewish chaplains who occasionally visited the camp to serve Jewish prisoners treated with the same respect as Christian chaplains? If Americans were mongrels without culture, why did the camp library contain thousands of books in multiple languages? Why were prisoners permitted to organize theatrical productions and concerts? Why was education encouraged rather than forbidden? The questions accumulated slowly, each one small enough to dismiss individually but cumulatively impossible to ignore. The bread remained the central symbol, the recurring evidence that appeared 3 times daily and could not be explained away. White bread, wheat bread, occasionally rye bread in the German style. Soft, fresh, abundant. The bakery at Camp Concordia operated continuously, staffed by prisoner bakers working in facilities that would have been impressive in a German city, let alone a prison camp. The flour came from Kansas wheat, milled at nearby facilities, delivered in 100-pound sacks that were stacked in storerooms like sandbags. The Americans used wheat for bread the way Germans used potatoes for filler, as the cheap, abundant base of every meal. This casual use of wheat, a commodity that had required rationing in Germany even before the war, revealed an agricultural productivity that Hoffman had no framework to comprehend. How much wheat did America grow that it could feed millions of soldiers, support its allies through Lend-Lease, maintain civilian consumption at pre-war levels, and still provide fresh bread daily to enemy prisoners? The arithmetic was staggering. The scale became visible in other ways as prisoners worked and observed. Those assigned to the camp motor pool reported that American military vehicles were maintained to standards higher than German civilian vehicles, that spare parts were abundant, that vehicles were sometimes scrapped and replaced rather than endlessly repaired. Those working in the camp hospital reported medical supplies that seemed infinite: bandages, antiseptics, medications, all standardized and mass-produced. The camp dentist, a German prisoner who had practiced in Hamburg before the war, told Hoffman that the dental equipment available to him in the camp was superior to what he had used in his private practice, that the Americans provided materials for fillings and extractions that were considered luxuries in German military dentistry. Every detail pointed to the same conclusion: American industrial capacity was not merely greater than German capacity. It was greater by orders of magnitude that rendered comparison meaningless. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, even the most ideologically committed prisoners could not ignore the trajectory of the war. The newspapers available in the camp library, American newspapers, printed in German for the prisoner population, reported the advance of Allied armies on both fronts. The maps showed the Reich shrinking month by month. The casualty lists grew longer. And still the bread came, the cigarettes remained available, the supply trains arrived on schedule. The contrast became almost obscene. German prisoners in Kansas were living better than German soldiers on the front lines, better than German civilians at home, perhaps better than they themselves had lived before being conscripted. This reversal of expectations was ideologically intolerable but factually undeniable. Hoffman began attending the re-education programs that the American authorities offered, not required, but encouraged, in the latter half of 1944. These were lectures on American government, American history, democratic principles. They were transparently propagandistic in intent, designed to undermine Nazi ideology and prepare prisoners for eventual repatriation to a post-war Germany that would need to be rebuilt on democratic foundations. Hoffman was initially skeptical, attending more out of boredom than genuine interest. But the lectures were not what he expected. They did not demonize Germany or Germans. They did not gloat over Allied victories. Instead, they focused on explaining the American system, how democracy functioned, how power was constrained by law, how individual rights were protected, how economic freedom generated prosperity. The lecturer, an American officer who had taught political science before the war, was careful to acknowledge that the American system was imperfect, that it had failed its own ideals in many ways, but that the principles remained sound and that the system was capable of self-correction over time. What struck Hoffman most powerfully was the connection the lecturer drew between political freedom and material abundance. The bread, the cigarettes, the endless flow of supplies, these were not accidents or temporary advantages. They were products of a system that encouraged innovation, rewarded productivity, and distributed prosperity widely enough that workers had incentives to work efficiently. The lecturer described the American industrial mobilization, the conversion of automobile factories to tank production, the Liberty Ship program, the Manhattan Project, all examples of what could be achieved when free people chose to coordinate their efforts toward a common goal. The contrast with the German system was implicit but clear. Central planning under dictatorship could achieve impressive results in the short term, but free markets under democracy generated sustained innovation and productivity that authoritarian systems could not match. The evidence was all around them. The prisoners were living that evidence daily, eating it in the form of fresh bread, smoking it in the form of free cigarettes, observing it in every detail of the camp's operation. Not everyone was convinced. Many prisoners clung to Nazi ideology with the desperation of men who had invested their identities in a cause and could not bear to admit it had been wrong. Some argued that American abundance proved not the superiority of democracy but the moral bankruptcy of materialism, that Germans fought for higher ideals while Americans fought for comfort, and that this made German defeat noble rather than shameful. Others retreated into conspiracy theories, insisting that the camps were elaborate deceptions, that the real America was suffering just as much as Germany but hiding it from the prisoners. But increasingly, these arguments sounded hollow even to those making them. The evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent, too present in every moment of daily life. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The news reached Camp Concordia by radio and was confirmed by official announcement. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich had ceased to exist. Hitler was dead, the Nazi leadership captured or scattered, the Wehrmacht dissolved. For the prisoners, the immediate reaction was shock and grief, not for the Nazi regime, which few had genuinely loved, but for Germany itself, for the abstract idea of homeland now occupied and divided. But beneath the grief was a more complex emotion that many prisoners could not name: relief. The war was over. They had survived. And now, slowly, they could begin to process what they had witnessed and experienced. Repatriation took time. Camps in America were slowly emptied over the course of 1945 and 1946 as prisoners were screened, classified, and eventually shipped back to Europe. Some prisoners, particularly those deemed politically reliable, were offered opportunities to remain in the United States as immigrant laborers, a program that thousands accepted, choosing exile over return to a devastated homeland. Hoffman was not among them. He returned to Germany in March 1946, sailing back across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship ironically named for an American president, landing in Bremerhaven, and making his way by train and foot back to Saxony. What he found there confirmed everything he had feared. His city was rubble. His family's apartment building had been destroyed in the bombing. His mother and brother had survived and were living in a basement room shared with 3 other families. Food was scarce. The occupation authorities provided rations, but they were minimal. The black market flourished, and everything cost absurd amounts in the worthless currency. Hoffman stood in the bread line on his 3rd day home, waiting for his ration, 200 grams of dark bread, heavy with sawdust filler, and he thought of Kansas. He thought of the bakery at Camp Concordia, of the soft white bread served 3 times daily, of the casual abundance that had seemed like a cruel joke but was simply how America operated. He thought of the cigarettes, of the chocolate bars available in the canteen, of the complaints he had heard from American guards about the quality of the coffee or the monotony of the menu. He thought of the farm where he had worked one summer harvest, of the farmer's teenage son driving a tractor that would have been a prize exhibit in a German agricultural museum, complaining that it was old and needed replacing. He thought of the electricity that never failed, the hot showers, the heated barracks, the medical care, the mail that arrived regularly, the whole vast machinery of American logistics that had operated so smoothly that he had almost stopped noticing it. And he understood, finally and completely, why Germany had lost. It was not a matter of courage. German soldiers had fought as bravely as any in history. It was not a matter of tactics or strategy, though mistakes had been made. It was not even, primarily, a matter of Hitler's madness, though that had contributed. Germany had lost because it had challenged a system that could produce fresh bread for its prisoners of war while simultaneously supplying armies on multiple continents, building atomic bombs, and maintaining civilian prosperity at levels that seemed fantastical. Germany had lost because it had based its ideology on the premise that hardship and sacrifice made nations strong, and that premise was false. Prosperity made nations strong. Freedom made nations strong. And America, for all its flaws and contradictions, had built a system that generated both. The lesson was bitter, but it was clear. Hoffman carried it with him through the years of occupation and reconstruction, through the slow rebuilding of his life in a new Germany that emerged from the ruins of the old. He never spoke much about his time in Kansas. What was there to say that would not sound like fantasy or betrayal? But he remembered. He remembered the bread. And when his children complained about the prosperity of the 1960s Wirtschaftswunder, about the materialism and Americanization of German culture, about the loss of older values, he would think back to that cattle truck arriving in Concordia, to the smell of baking bread drifting across the flat Kansas landscape, to the moment when he first understood that everything he had been taught was wrong. The bread had been more than sustenance. It had been argument, encoded in flour and yeast and delivered 3 times daily with such abundance that prisoners stopped noticing it. It was the argument that systems matter, that institutions shape outcomes, that freedom and prosperity reinforce each other in ways that tyranny and sacrifice never can. It was an argument that could not be refuted through rhetoric or ideology because it was physical, edible, undeniable. You could debate political theory in the abstract, but you could not debate fresh bread. It was there on the plate, real and tangible, produced by a system that worked whether you believed in it or not. Thousands of German prisoners returned home carrying that memory. Some denied it, some rationalized it, some tried to forget it. But others absorbed the lesson and carried it forward into the construction of a new Germany. A Germany that would embrace democracy not as an imposed foreign ideology but as a practical system proven to generate better outcomes than the alternatives. The Federal Republic built after 1949 was shaped by many factors: Allied occupation policies, Cold War pressures, the exhaustion of militarism, the trauma of total defeat. But it was also shaped, in small and mostly unacknowledged ways, by the memories of men who had eaten American bread in Kansas prison camps and understood that abundance was not a sign of weakness but a foundation of strength. The irony was lost on no one who had lived through it, that America had won the war not despite its prosperity but because of it, and that the prisoners who had been captured in defeat had been given a more visceral education in democratic capitalism than any amount of political theory could have provided. They had been fed the evidence, literally and daily, that the system they had fought against was not merely militarily superior but functionally superior, capable of producing wealth and distributing it widely enough that even enemies were sustained at levels exceeding what their own homeland could provide. In the end, the bread was the war in miniature, a quiet, unglamorous demonstration that logistics defeats ideology, that systems built on human freedom outperform systems built on coercion, and that the true strength of democracy lies not in its rhetoric but in its results. The prisoners who ate that bread and returned home to a devastated Reich carried with them, whether they admitted it or not, the knowledge that they had touched the future and found it substantial, filling, and made of wheat. The cattle truck that had delivered Hoffman to Camp Concordia in June 1944 had carried him into a world he had been taught to despise and had discovered he could not honestly deny. The train that carried him away in March 1946 brought him back to a homeland that would spend decades rebuilding on principles that seemed, at first, foreign and imposed but would eventually be recognized as simply functional, practical solutions to the problem of how free people govern themselves and prosper together. And if those principles were accompanied by soft white bread and abundant cigarettes. If prosperity came wrapped in the same package as democracy, then perhaps that was not decadence but simple wisdom, that systems which work for their people work better than systems which work against them, and that freedom, when given the chance, feeds itself.